Alfred North Whitehead once said that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Basically, why? Well, Plato asks all these questions that have essentially remained the philosophical questions ever since. Lots of the philosophical questions have broken off from philosophy proper and become things like psychology, anthropology, biology. Those, basically anything you were interested in was philosophy initially. In any case, Plato is one pillar and gives us idealism, and Aristotle, his student, is more realism. That's not exactly what people call him, but basically realism is an easy way to think of it, because we agree today that you need stuff. Plato thought the ideas were what structured, the world somehow. In a way, you could tie that into Pythagoras. Remember, for Pythagoras, the building block of everything was the arche of number. And you can't get more abstract than mathematics, really, to think that somehow mathematics is what structures this. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah.
Matt.
You said the word arche there.
Yeah.
And I'm just really curious about what that
okay.
word is.
So it's a Greek word that basically we use in like architecture. Like the arch, the T-stone in an arch, arche. Archaeology, but it's really untranslatable.
Yeah.
When you think, here's what they use it for, how do we translate that into English? There's so many words that are like that. Heck, even when we're speaking in English and we're supposedly fluent speakers, we might not understand one another. You can see that especially with the divide we currently have in our country, really. Awful lot of that is a linguistic interpretation problem, I think. Okay, well, so last class I was talking at least about his introduction or invention of categorical reasoning, the idea of creating categories. And remember, there's a whole book called Categories that he wrote, and that's where you get a lot of descriptions of what we would call grammar. How the words are arranged. How you pick this set of things is called this word. And if you think about it, oh my goodness, how do you do that? An awful lot of the trouble we have scientifically today is a problem of drawing lines, creating these categories when we have something, Darwin's big issue, when you've got finches that are all finches, but they have slightly different characteristics. Ooh, well, okay, is that sufficient to say they're not finches? That you ought to have a separate category for these birds? But what enables us to decide, okay, well, these are all finches in the finch family, but this one has this kind of beak, this one has this, these have different plumage from one island to another. I suppose one of the most famous of these issues is swans, the old adage that all swans are white, and apparently that's what Europeans thought for quite a long time, but guess what? There are black swans. I mean, that's so famous that there's even a book that was written exactly about that. Is it plural or singular? Well, this is the book. I'm not familiar with the second edition, but you've heard of Heck, there was a movie not too long ago about a ballet star, The Black Swan, I guess, right? I never saw that. But
Weird.
I tend to shy away from things of that
Okay.
sort, actually.
That's good. Kind of a
Because-
psychological thriller. I don't know if thriller is the right word, but it's a trip. It's a trip.
Well, I did see 2001: A Space Odyssey. And
That's true.
years after I watched it and was absolutely befuddled by it, I heard that you really wouldn't understand it unless you were on LSD while you were watching it. I thought, well, I'm never going to understand it then, you know, because frankly, shy away from all that stuff if you ever want a clearance. Although, who gets a clearance today is an interesting new thing. Sorry. However, so the black swan, you know, I mean, you used to always hear all swans are white. Swans were a category, but part of the things that defined what fit into that category was that they were white. And then they discovered, well, no, wait a minute, there are black swans. I mean, this book talks about black swans as when you use statistics to measure something and you feel like, aha, all swans are white. Oh, wait a minute, here's a black swan.
No.
Why does that not create its own category? Why does that still remain a swan if that was such a significant part of what you meant by a swan? So, deciding where the borders are of these categories, you know, people talk about English as if it's a language, and I always, like to point out that so much of English is actually other languages that English has absorbed. Even from the very beginnings of what we call English, it seems to have been that way. And it's not really the case that other languages like French has just always been purely French. It's actually a Romance language. It comes from Latin with other influences and so on. And the neat theory I heard once was that when the Romans conquered Gaul, which became France, they were speaking a type of Latin that essentially became the beginnings of French. When they conquered Spain, they were speaking a type of Latin that eventually became Spanish. Romania, you get the idea, that the vulgar or common Latin that the Romans spoke changed over time, just as English does, right? So I'm not sure really how you draw a border around the language and say this is English, this is German. There's so many. Funky music. You've heard of that? I don't know if we use that anymore, but I remember when I was in Berlin, one of the places we went, there's a restaurant, they have a tower that was built by Hitler in order to be better than the Eiffel Tower, and it's called the Funkturm, which means radio tower. And when you hear funky music, that was after the GIs were in Germany and they picked up German words, and funk, became, well, wait a minute, it's not a radio apparat, a funk apparat. So you get the idea. Languages are porous, they're just constantly interacting with one another. It was funny, years ago, Canada, or Ontario specifically, said, you have to speak French, and you're not allowed to use English words in the French. And they were trying to block the English words from encroaching on French, because they wanted to keep a French community in that part of Canada, which more or less has certainly remained that way, pretty much. Okay, so categories. How on earth do we keep categories straight? And plus, they nest in one another. Today we talked about family, genus, etc. Right? There are subcategories and so on. You could basically say we've got red bother anyone? No Taurus.
As long as I'm not the one writing it.
Okay. So, just assuming these are all animals. Inside of animals, we might have ruminants. Inside of ruminants, we might have horses specifically. Inside of horses, we might have thoroughbreds. Inside of thoroughbreds, we might have mares. And notice how the four how these work. You know, when you say all mares are thoroughbred, or you know, in this particular group, because I labeled it thoroughbreds, but in any cases they're all horses. And all horses are also ruminants, and all ruminants are animals. And all animals are things, you know, or some, you know, however you want to. So notice how they nest in. Of course, you can have cows over here. So keep in mind that some are not, etc. And when you look at a syllogism, which you know, what you're essentially doing in a syllogism named Barbara, there are codes. So the reason Barbara is used is because it's 3 A's, so you have 3 A statements. I might say, for example, all terrorists are evil. Saddam Hussein is or was a terrorist. Therefore, Saddam must be evil. And so you'd see how easily, Barbara leads you to the conclusion. As long as the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Because essentially you're saying, here's evil, all the terrorists are evil, and all of Saddam Hussein, who's a complete set to himself. That's how you handle proper nouns, right? He's a terrorist, therefore he's evil. So if you're going to disagree with George Bush, who basically gave that argument, you would have to disprove the premises. If you accepted the premises, you have to accept the conclusion. And that's the way deductive arguments work. And the syllogistic system is a deductive system. So a deductive system basically says you know this stuff, and based on knowing this stuff is also true. So it follows from what you already know. So in a deductive system, strictly speaking, you're not learning anything new, because all the knowledge is already gathered, which that's what Aristotle was doing with all of his committees or friends or whoever helped him gather everything. Alexander the Great helped, sending him all kinds of things. Remember, he was just, conquering the world, Alexander, crying once he got to the mountains in Afghanistan because there were no more worlds to conquer, because he thought that was the end of the earth. So he cried because, I can't go kill any more people. I have to come back and kill more people this way, which he did, etc. But he would send things to Aristotle in Athens, and Athens had a school just down the road from the academy, which was the Platonic school, and they had the Lyceum, which was Aristotle's school. And by the way, Aristotle liked to walk while he was teaching, so you'll also see that it's called the Peripatetic school, which means walking around. But in any case, all of his works basically are just describing, like if you saw the Aristotle's Lagoon, a lot of his categories were wrong historically, and you can see what would lead to some of that He didn't realize there was oxygen in water. That's one of my favorites. So he thought fish were somehow, not animals breathing air, but breathing water somehow. Now, of course, we know that oxygen is a gas in the water, and so you can still be oxygen breathing in water, as long as there's oxygen in it, in any case, right? So Aristotle, of course, had